Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mariana. I'm events coordinator here at America House. And for me, it's such a big pleasure to see such a nice crowd here. Tonight, we're happy to have this great opportunity and invite John Callahan as our guest speaker. And today he will talk on the U.S. foreign policy. John Callahan is director for combined online military programs in international relations and homeland security for New England College, and he has taught there since 2010. He received a PhD in international studies from Old Dominion University in 2015. His dissertation examined U.S. foreign policy and strategic communication in humanitarian interventions. From 2007 to 2017, John served as a consultant to the Joint Public Affairs Support Element, U.S. Transportation Command, and the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. He continues to serve in an advisory capacity to U.S. Marine Forces in Europe. Dr. Callahan served as a deputy spokesman at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Prior to this, John was honored to be selected by the Department of Defense and Department of State to serve as a public affairs officer at the American Embassy in Baghdad, Iraq, and many more. And today, I'm happy, and please join me in welcoming John Callahan.
All right. So I heard my own bio, and I'm sure everyone thinks I'm like a spy that came here from my bio. But I promise that I'm a professor, and the university that I teach for is in New Hampshire. It's called New England College, and it's a school that began shortly after the Second World War with the purpose of helping to educate American soldiers who came home from the Second World War. It's called the GI Bill. Enabling American troops to get an education. So I've worked there since 2010, and my role now is to direct the programs that she said in international relations and homeland security, with a focus toward, again, still helping military guys who are often even still serving to get their bachelor's degrees and their master's degrees while they are in service. So it's an interesting group of students. It's not your typical undergraduate and graduate students. I got to ask a question first, just so I know. How many folks in here are American? I know one guy is, but a couple? Oh, I guess the flag's no giveaway. A few. Okay, cool. So normally what I've done, and I did it this morning, is I speak to university audiences. And I talk about theoretical things about U.S. foreign policy. And I also end up answering a lot of questions about what it's like to have a career like this and to be sort of in the U.S. Government and then out. But I think that what I would like to do in this case, because it's quite a different audience, is talk a little bit about my research, but then actually have it be more of a discussion and answer your questions and even maybe facilitate discussions among the group. So if everybody's okay with that, you don't have a choice, so you can be okay. Then, okay. So my career gave me I think a pretty unique perspective, going from getting my master's degree in international relations and then actually somebody who put it into practice working for the State Department. But I want to emphasize that I am an academic now. I don't speak for the U.S. government. I'm not employed by the U.S. government at the moment. And so these are all my own opinions based on my own research and experience. So just to throw that out there. So when I went to my university, Old Dominion University, to get my PhD, I really wanted to write something about war. It's what I've always studied as an amateur historian, as a political scientist. But I realized that with the professors there, no one was going to let me write something straight up about war. So how to get at something that's got some war in it, but is also a little softer and a little more useful. And what I focused on was the sort of decision-making processes and the framing that surrounded several critical U.S. interventions after the end of the Cold War. And what I wanted to look at was how popular is fighting in the U.S.? How popular are the interventions where we go abroad and we do something and maybe soldiers get killed? And so that led me to look at a series of humanitarian interventions which took place in those years. And I'm talking about Somalia, Kosovo, Libya, these types of things. And my research actually ended before we decided to get involved in Syria, but it is one of the things that I sort of touched on. I covered up until about 2013. So I covered the point when President Obama decided not to intervene with the famous red line and that sort of thing. So that said, I'm happy to carry the discussion forward to where my findings kind of impact on the current administration and how different things are. I'm happy to talk about anything, and if you can believe me or not, but it's all my opinion, so we'll see how it goes. Any questions from anybody before I talk a little more? Anything you specifically want me to touch on?
The critical intervention in Iraq war.
Well, I can talk about it. I didn't in my research because it wasn't really humanitarian. It was a war. But I'm happy to talk about it because what this goes to is the idea of wars of choice and wars of necessity.
The roles of neocons.
Well, that too, and so actually you find that there's a big jump. You have the Somalia intervention, which began as a true humanitarian intervention that was just undertaken by the military, and became what I'll call a militarized intervention, where we were actually fighting, and ended tragically with the Black Hawk Down incident. And then, of course, we didn't intervene in Rwanda for several important reasons. Then you have Kosovo, definitely a military intervention, purely with armed force. Then you have that big giant hole from 2000 up until 2011, because we were doing humanitarian operations. We did them, but primarily we were just doing straight up military operations like Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. So an important distinction from my research was that when I say armed humanitarian intervention, I mean fighting. In the Indonesian tsunami, for example, we used military force to provide aid, but that was just because it was expedient. Aircraft carriers carry a lot of stuff, but there was no fighting. So also those type of interventions are wildly popular at home because there's no fighting. So I wanted to look at situations where there was a hard discussion, both at the cabinet level and in the public, and where there was a real problem justifying the intervention. And unsurprisingly, when the United States launches a military intervention of choice, they're really not very popular. In every case I looked at, maybe popular support would be just over 50%, just when the operation began, and would quickly drop down, no matter what. Whether it was Kosovo with Bill Clinton, or Libya with Operation Odyssey Dawn with Obama. It may be surprising, but Americans really do not like to send their young men and women abroad to die. We actually truly don't, in spite of how it may look, just because of what's going on in the world. Now, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were different because those were, Afghanistan was actually shown as a war of necessity. We were attacked, we attacked back. I don't think that holds now, 15 years later, but at the beginning, that was the war that I think the whole world expected us to fight. And we did it extremely well, and then for some reason we stayed, which is where the problem came. You know, Iraq has a whole different set of internal politics, but Iraq was still framed as a war of necessity. and I see a response. Obviously, it wasn't. There was a war of choice, unquestionably. But if you remember the media and the government statements that surrounded it, it was absolutely shown as part of the response to 9/11 as a war of necessity. And in retrospect, obviously, it's not. But at the time, it definitely seemed to be. So that was a long answer to one question, but somebody else had a question on this side too. Yep. I think you were next, yeah?
Me?
Yeah. Well, somebody had a question over there.
Yeah, I guess a lot of headaches. I've written books about those as well.
Sure.
I went to university with former Somali diplomat to Great Britain, Canada, Abdullah Kare, Hashi, whatever. He instilled in me empathetic views for, his people. They were starving, blah blah blah. I'm not a spy either. Don't work for the government. I'm here because I'm married to someone and I've had cancer and lots of surgeries. I'm chilling out. But anyway, I knew some people. I made the suggestion to supply aid to Somalia, and ultimately General Garrison screwed it up, converted it to a military mission, hence Black Hawk Down.
Sure.
And that opened up the region for terrorism, pirating, blah, 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 and it's been a cluster ever since. Let's see. Let's assume that Libya started out the same way. Very constructive humanitarian intervention thoughts, and then the UN, US, France, etc. sort of pushed that boundaries a little bit more and resulted in a failed state and opened up the door for lots of political negativity that created additional chaos in the region. Iraq, first Gulf War, in and out in 100 hours, 4 days, 4 hours, call it a day. The return was idiotic because there were no WMDs, and Hans Blix, all those guys at the UN inspection regime said there wasn't any. I also worked on the planning of the first Gulf War. A lot of that strategy was mine.
What were you going to ask, though?
Well, I see your views. You're on point with those. Afghanistan again, cluster, stay forever.
Okay. So more of an observation here.
Yeah, those observations
Yeah.
were mine. I wrote the books on all of those.
Cool. And then actually maybe you first. We just in order, yeah.
I would like also to lay a small kind of background for your main speech, and my question would be like, do you consider that the world right now and before is in truth, peace, or war?
Okay.
Because for many, we are at peace some kind.
Yep.
Not for me.
That's a good. I'm happy to talk about that one. Yes, sir.
About the bigger issue,
Yeah.
about the use of American might
Mm-hmm.
and treasuries for Israel. They use USA might and treasury as a proxy. Maybe you can touch upon this question.
Okay.
It's very important. I think.
Sure.
Because many wars we touch now upon are connected to this question.
Yeah. So this is good. I'm going to talk about your question first. So the U.S. military and the U.S. culture views war as a black and white thing. We're at war or we are not. The U.S. traditionally believes in technological means of waging war. We greatly prefer and have always preferred to send a bullet or a cannonball or an airplane or something instead of a soldier. It's always been our way. There's great strength in that. There's also some weakness in that. And when you look at American intelligence, we tend to rely a lot on technical means, spy satellites and listening and everything that the NSA is accused of doing rightly or wrongly. But the reality is that we have a fetish for technology in the United States. And because of the way we like to fight wars, we try to make wars into something we can fight. You understand? There's a saying that when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Does it make sense? Yeah. And so at this moment, parts of the U.S. military are attempting to understand something called what they call the gray zone of conflict. And what you have, and I don't want to go too far down this road, but you have Western militaries with a fundamentally Clausewitzian view of war as operations. Clausewitz says war is politics by other means, and war is compelling the enemy to do your will through the use of armed strength. And you contrast this with a fundamentally Sun Tzuist view or Eastern or Asian view of war, which is much more total and much more societal and economic. And if you take that view of war, then the world is absolutely at war at this moment. Absolutely, no question. It is just types of war that the U.S. doesn't necessarily want to fight. It doesn't mean that we're not good at fighting those type of wars. I mean, I think if you walk down the street and see a McDonald's, you realize that the U.S. actually has a great depth of soft power, passive soft power. We're not always so great at active soft power, but I'm riding on the train and there's something called summer camp, and it says it in English, and it's not in British English. It's definitely in American English. So the problem is the world is at war, definitely. And even if you take a Clausewitzian perspective that war is compelling your enemy to do what you want, well, I think when you use cyber warfare on someone and you let the bots loose, you were trying to compel them to do your will. I think when the electricity goes out in Riga for a day, that is an act of conflict. And it has the same purpose as military force does. And I'm just using an example that I know is regional and that a big regional power is doing here. But we do it too. Everybody does it in reality. And so the American military wants to call it the gray zone, but actually it's just war. It's just compellence. It's competition. It's a Hobbesian world where dog is eating dog. And it's quite difficult to wrap our heads around that, even I think 20 years after the end of the Cold War, because the Cold War was actually easy. The Cold War was easy. The bad guys were here and the good guys were home, and we weren't going to fight because if we fought, the world was going to blow up. That's easy, really. And you don't have major power conflict. You might fight in Vietnam with proxies, which goes to the question of proxy wars. But you're not going to fight, and the framework to operate in. And I talk about the Cold War because I'm 46. I graduated high school in 1990. But there's still a ton of senior planners in the U.S. military and State Department that absolutely were Cold Warriors, and they still think somewhat in those terms. So did that answer the question?
Actually, yes. And I do not want to bombard someone with some information, but for me, I can imply that we have one country like former Soviet Union, which was at war from its beginning.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
and it's...
And understood that it was at war and acted as if it was at war. Sure.
So,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So to maybe you'll talk a little bit about the decision-making process, and then something about maybe proxies. Okay, so I think it's a pretty advanced audience here, and with some understanding of how the national security decision-making process works at the highest levels. You've got the president and you've got the vice president, but that usually the vice president isn't much of a player. Again, except for an 8-year period where the vice president was incredibly powerful. It's not normal. There's a reason why Theodore Roosevelt didn't want to be vice president when McKinley asked him in the 1900 elections or 1902, whenever it was. Somebody said the vice presidency was, worth a warm cup of spit or something like that, and pretty much that's spot on. But you have the White House, the actual executive authority, and then you have the National Security Council, and that is an advisory body which is its size and purpose is totally at the whim of whoever the president is. The National Security Council can be 50 to 100 people, or it can be like over 1,000 people. And it totally depends on the personality of the president. Scholars generally say that the best national security team we've ever had was the team in the first Gulf War of President George Bush I. They were absolutely the best. We're talking about Brent Scowcroft, Bush himself, Dick Cheney as Secretary of Defense, Colin Powell, James Baker. These guys had worked together in various roles, working for each other or with each other or next to each other for 20 years since the Nixon administration. One year, Bush might be the head of the CIA or ambassador to the UN. And James Baker maybe works for him. And the next year, maybe it switches. So these guys had intimate relationships with each other. They understood completely, how each other worked, and they all supported the boss because they had grown up during the Cold War. Many of them had military backgrounds. Bush was the boss, and decision making was going to be made by him. You may not like it, but when he says go, you salute smartly and you go. Of course, civilians don't do that, but the principle is the same. So when Bush framed the Iraq War in terms of the 1930s and Nazi Germany, at first some of his team really weren't very happy with that. Colin Powell didn't like the idea. But when Bush went on air and talked to the media and basically said that if we didn't oppose Saddam Hussein, it was the same as Munich, where the British failed to stand up to Hitler. I mean, these are the terms that Bush used to frame the Iraq War. And once he did that, everybody said, yep, okay, we have to do it. No question. I would argue that in terms of the first Iraq War, there also was a little bit of, we built an amazing armed force in the 1980s, I think. And the Cold War was not going to end without that force getting used. And using that force, it's almost unfortunate. It's a pity for the Iraqis because they were attacked by probably the greatest mechanized force that ever was. And it took 100 hours. I mean, they folded. And I could tell you that people in Moscow watched that war closely, and they saw what their equipment and their tactics, what happened when they faced us. Anyway, that's sort of an aside. But the point is the mechanism of decision making. You have the National Security Council, and in the National Security Council, you have the National Security Advisor, who is the guy who is essentially supposed to specifically guide the president on international issues. He also may or may not be the leader of a group that consists of the senior cabinet members, like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. Now Homeland Security is a little bit involved. But a really critical issue is how do those guys relate to the president, and how do they relate to the National Security Advisor, and how does the president relate to the National Security Advisor? What do I mean by this? Cabinet officers always have the right to go directly to the president. They are confirmed by the Senate. They're in the Constitution. The National Security Advisor is not. So if the Secretary of State wants to talk to the president, they can pick up a phone or come over, in theory. So the person who is the National Security Advisor must have a unique personality to be able to juggle those other personalities that can always go around him if they want to. And you see a series of national security advisors, and you can tell how effective their president was going to be. Brent Scowcroft was the advisor for Bush, and everybody knew Bush was in charge. And Scowcroft led the team of the other cabinet members, and they were very comfortable working through him And while, yes, they did talk directly to the president, but they were quite comfortable going through Scowcroft. Then you get to Clinton, and Clinton had a series of national security advisors. And there's a reason, you remember Sandy Berger was his second-term national security advisor. Sorry? Yeah. In the era of Clinton, the cabinet members were much more powerful than the national security advisor was. That was because, in part, Clinton, especially at first, didn't want to deal with international issues. He wanted, he ran against Bush basically on domestic politics, on taxes. And that's what he wanted to do, and that's what he was good at. And so his domestic policy team was much better than his foreign policy team. By his second term, the foreign policy team got a lot better. And part of it is simply because they got experience, and they got experience working together, and they got experience understanding what Clinton wanted. But also what Clinton wanted changed in his second term. In Clinton's first term, he was a junior guy amongst people like Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl and Francois Mitterrand, the guy, and even Pope John Paul II, the people who won the Cold War. And Clinton was the junior guy. But by his second term, all those people were gone except the Pope. And Clinton was suddenly the senior guy in world politics. And his understanding and awareness changed, and he became a little more aware of foreign policy issues, and he began to understand how they could affect his domestic politics, which was always what he was most worried about. So then you move forward, and you get the Bush team, and the national security advisors in the Bush team are not names that you will remember going down the road, except maybe Condoleezza Rice, exactly. You remember Condoleezza Rice, but probably mainly because she became Secretary of State. I think that's her main contribution. And that's because the vice presidency dominated the White House. So then you move forward to Barack Obama. And his national security advisors will also not be well remembered, because Obama was another era where the cabinet officers themselves were incredibly powerful, and especially Hillary Clinton and Gates, Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State. But even when Gates left, Leon Panetta was also a very powerful cabinet member, and Chuck Hagel to a lesser extent, and they declined. Ash Carter was not a very powerful player, but it's because he was brought in at the end. And it's a rule of American politics that at the end of an administration, the people start to realize what's happening, and they start to leave. And usually about a year out, you begin to see cabinet members and their staff go. They got to secure their job for what's coming afterwards. Almost no president keeps the staff of his predecessor, even in the same party. Republicans don't normally keep the same people. Bush didn't keep... Sorry, let me get some water. Bush didn't keep a huge number of Reagan people. By the end of the 4 years, the Reagan people were definitely gone. And so the dynamics of the cabinet change, and so does their decision making. Sorry about this. It's definitely necessary though. So that's a little talk about the cabinets and decision making. You also have other big players in the process. Of course, you have powerful legislators. John McCain is probably one of the most powerful influences on foreign policy, for good or bad, in the last 20 years. When you have the influence, it's important to use it wisely. And Syria is probably an example of where influence like that wasn't helpful, especially at the beginning. So you've also got the media. You've got big think tanks. You've got all the various classes. You also have the influence of allies. I mean, Libya, the Libyan intervention is absolutely the influence of allies on the United States. Yes, sir.
I was actually going to ask specifically about that.
Yeah.
When I got the chances, there's this narrative out there that France kind of dragged us into Libya because Sarkozy was doing the typical tactic of look strong for his re-election.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you could
While being paid by Libyans for his election campaign or something like that. Yeah. So this is a great example of the dynamics. You have personal methods of the presidents. Bush, just to give a 10-second on how we get to Obama, right? Bush would get the information from his cabinet and from Scowcroft, and he would act. He would make a decision, and then everybody executes. Clinton was somewhat like that, especially on domestic issues. He was a little bit more deliberative, meaning he would have a vote, on foreign policy issues. The second Bush White House was not super deliberative. Somebody in the White House made a decision, and whether it was the vice presidency or the presidency, that's open to debate, but decisions were made. The Obama presidency, you remember when Obama came to office, he openly tried to emulate Lincoln. And they had this idea of, what's the book by Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals or something like that, where, Lincoln's cabinet all hated each other. And the book's supposition is that made for a very strong presidency because everybody Lincoln was able to preside over all these guys who hated each other. My view really is that the Lincoln presidency was not very successful, and using it as a model was a terrible idea. I mean, for Obama to bring Hillary Clinton into his White House, it was done for tactical reasons. She was the runner-up candidate. The Clinton branch of the Democratic Party was incredibly powerful, and so she had to be brought in. But they didn't want to bring her in. And why would they when the objectives of the Clinton branch of the party and the rest of the Democratic Party never were in line? Some people Obama was forced to take, like Clinton. Some people he chose to take, like Gates. He kept a Republican, openly Republican Secretary of Defense. And it turned out to be a really great idea because Gates had experience and the Obama team very much did not. You look at the people in the Obama administration, like Susan Rice, who before she became National Security Advisor to, first she was ambassador to the UN and then National Security Advisor. But her most noteworthy thing was during the Rwanda intervention in the 90s, there was a call of a working group to decide if we should intervene. And she's noted as being the one who said, there's a midterm election coming up, and this isn't worth it. That was her great impact on U.S. foreign policy before but she was the senior sort of foreign policy person to support Obama. So then you have Samantha Power, whose sole contribution to foreign policy was writing a couple of books about how, not bad books, about the U.S. interventions or the lack of intervention in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, and Kosovo. And she, her thing was like responsibility to protect. That national sovereignty should be second place to human security. That was her contribution, and it's a great contribution. But bottom line is, she's now the ambassador to the UN and in a senior White House advisory position after writing a couple of books. So there you go. The Obama administration was called the deliberative presidency. Whenever a decision came up or an issue occurred, they would essentially have a vote, and whoever could sway the vote on an issue, that's what Obama would choose. I mean, it's not a bad way. It's not very reflexive or responsive or timely, but it's not necessarily a bad way to make decisions. So Libya, the Arab Spring begins, and the world is absolutely caught by surprise. Shouldn't have been, but they were caught by surprise. And the Obama administration made a couple of very big statements about Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. The administration showed a willingness to jump in to something that it absolutely didn't understand, with what I think everybody can acknowledge are some pretty disastrous results now. I'm not trying to be partisan, and it's definitely hindsight, but they for once they jumped in. They made some statements without a lot of deliberation. But then Libya began to happen, and Libya developed over about 6 weeks, and you had many factions in the government. If you read Gates's autobiography, he was absolutely against intervention in Libya. And why? The generals almost never want to intervene because they know what's going to happen. They understand war. It's almost always civilians who push for intervention and generals and military guys who want to go more slowly. You find that in throughout the history of the Cold War and post-Cold War era. And so you have Gates on one side. At the beginning, Hillary Clinton was also against the intervention. She and Gates had a very close position on the issue, and they talked about it all the time. They in both of their memoirs, they mention the discussions that they had and how it was basically a bad idea because it was obvious that Libya was not a core U.S. Defense or foreign policy issue. People acknowledged it. It's like, this isn't that big of a deal. You know, okay, I get it that Italy and France get a lot of their oil from Libya, but we don't. Muammar Gaddafi had been one of the most cooperative guys on earth with us since, after we bombed him. So you have the guys that were against intervention. The ones that were for intervention were Samantha Power, Susan Rice, and most notably Joe Biden, who is actually a fairly powerful vice president. Not like Cheney, but he had a vote, and he had a powerful voice, and he was a foreign policy expert. He was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for the Democrats for eons. He's a smart guy. So at first, the cabinet was deadlocked, or the main votes. And Obama basically said, we're not going to do it. We're not going to intervene unless a majority of my cabinet say it's a good thing. Well, now enter Sarkozy and what's it called in Libya, like the National Army, the guys in Benghazi. Hillary Clinton went on a trip and she met with Sarkozy, and she was doing a Europe thing. And she met with some of the National Resistance Army, or whatever they were called. And she became convinced through these conversations that we needed to go. We needed to do it. And obviously, if you're going to do something militarily, the U.S. has to be involved. And you can call it leading from behind, but the simple fact is there are certain operations that can't be done without things that the U.S. has, especially command and control, the ability to move forces with aircraft and ships. There are things that nobody else can do, really. And so we're going to be involved. And there was literally a vote by phone, and she changed her vote and said, no, we need to intervene, and left Cheney alone, or not Cheney, Gates out on his own. And he's quite bitter about it in his memoirs, and I think rightly so. So the vote was taken, and the intervention took place. Now, the other side, I know framing is in my title.
But is it
Yeah.
real? Is it real? I mean, the decision of Gaddafi not to sell oil for dollars, probably the main reason for it.
No, they-
Oh, I don't think it had anything to do with it at all. I mean, the discourse in the States.
It have been a main bad example for other Arab states.
You mean, say it again.
It could have been another bad example for other Arab states not to sell oil for dollars.
Oh.
Do you mind if I comment on that?
Yeah, sure.
I was writing Susan,
Rice.
yeah. Is that right? Yeah. The UN ambassador at that time.
Yep, that's her.
Suggesting intervention, as long as it was constructive, like the first Gulf War. I wrote a lot of things that went through back channels to Bush. I even set the 6-month deadline, giving Saddam plenty of time to back out of Kuwait. I suggested he bypass Congress, go straight to the UN to organize a coalition to, all the countries in the world to try to go against it because of the economic. I mean, that is the gas station to the world at the time. And if Saddam would have got in power, he would have created chaos in that region, which unfortunately I think we did later. But Clinton, very quickly, Sandy Berger, Madeleine Albright, and others wanted to go back to war with Clinton. I was saying, no, it's stupid. There's no justified reason to go back, blah, blah, blah. We've dismantled his weapons, etc. He gave up quickly. They were calling me at my university trying to get me to put together a position paper. I'm like, dude, I've got exams tomorrow. Can't you take freaking notes? And and they were insisting I write a paper, and I'm like, my fax is tore up. I can't fax it to you. And they got me to go to Lexington to.
But
And
Libya.
Flash forward
Libya.
to Libya. Gaddafi was a very bad guy. When he slaughtered anybody and everything, pisses me off.
Well,
To this day,
that-
just like simple.
About how U.S. foreign policy is made, though, and the philosophy of U.S. foreign policy, and I don't mean from professors, but the U.S. goes back and forth between